Joel Kramer had worked in Alaska's backcountry for nearly 2 decades. His weathered face and calloused hands, testament to countless days spent patrolling its vast wilderness. As a park ranger stationed in one of the remotest stretches of the Tongass National Forest, he'd seen his fair share of oddities, eerie weather patterns that defied meteorological explanation, strange animal behaviors that contradicted everything he'd learned in his training, and the occasional disoriented hiker swearing they'd heard voices in the woods. It all came with the territory, part of the peculiar tapestry of life in America's last true wilderness. But the hum, that was something new. Something that would eventually make him question everything he thought he knew about the natural world. It started subtly, like most things that eventually destroy your peace of mind. Joel first noticed it on a quiet evening while patrolling near Pinecrest Trail, a seldom used path that wound through a dense grove of ancient Sitka spruce. The massive trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining so thickly they created a natural cathedral ceiling that filtered the waning daylight into ghostly shapes on the forest floor. The air had been unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes your ears strain for any sound, and as twilight settled like a heavy blanket over the landscape, he'd pause to take in the fading light. That's when he heard it, a low, resonant sound, almost like the hum of a tuning fork struck by an unseen hand. It was faint, so faint he thought he might have imagined it, nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination in the gathering darkness. But the longer he stood there, feet rooted to the moss-covered ground, the clearer it became. A deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, as if the ancient spruces had finally decided to give voice to centuries of silent watching. Wind through the branches, he'd told himself, though the air was motionless as death. His scientific mind grasped for rational explanations, distant machinery, underground water movement, even the aurora borealis, which sometimes created audible phenomena, shrugging it off with the practiced ease of someone used to explaining away the inexplicable. He'd returned to the ranger station, dismissing the hum as nothing more than a curious trick of acoustics in the complex terrain of the Alaskan wilderness. But the hum didn't stay confined to that one evening, like most rational explanations should. Instead, it grew, spreading through the forest like an invisible contagion. A week later, Joel's radio crackled to life, static cutting through the perpetual quiet of his small station office. "Joel," came the familiar voice of his colleague Sarah Martinez, a tone of concern evident even through the radio's distortion. "We've got a couple of hikers who need help near the Ridgewater Fork. They're claiming they heard something and got lost trying to follow it. Can you check it out?" Sarah had been working these woods almost as long as Joel, and the note of unease in her voice set off warning bells in his mind. Joel frowned, his hand automatically reaching for his well-worn pack as he processed the location. Ridgewater Fork was close to Pinecrest Trail, too close for comfort. "What exactly did they hear?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Could feel it in the growing heaviness of his gut. Sarah hesitated, radio silence stretching for a moment too long. "They said it was singing, or maybe humming. Something about it being impossible to ignore. Weird, right?" Her attempt at casual dismissal fell flat, laden with unspoken concern. He muttered a response and drove his truck to the trailhead, gravel crunching under the tires like brittle bones. The sun was dipping low by the time he found the hikers, a young couple clutching each other near a moss-covered boulder, their modern outdoor gear incongruous against the primeval backdrop of the forest. Their faces were pale, their voices shaky, and their eyes held that particular look Joel had seen before in people who'd encountered something their minds couldn't quite process. It sounded like music, the woman said, her fingers digging into her partner's jacket. But not like anything I've ever heard. It was beautiful, but wrong. Like a symphony played in a key that shouldn't exist. She swallowed hard, her throat working against some emotion Joel couldn't quite name. We tried to follow it, but the trail just disappeared. It was like the forest shifted around us, like it was leading us somewhere we shouldn't go. Joel escorted them back to safety, maintaining a professional demeanor that betrayed none of his growing unease. But their words stuck with him, echoing in his mind like the hum itself. Beautiful, but wrong. That night, he lay awake in his cabin, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. The hum, faint and distant, seemed to drift through his open window, like an uninvited guest that had finally found its way home. It carried with it a promise of secrets, of knowledge better left buried in the deep places of the earth. Over the next month, the reports multiplied like darkness spreading across an evening sky. Hikers claimed to hear the hum, each description adding another layer to its mysterious nature. They spoke of a deep, vibrating resonance that seemed to pull them off the trails, a sound that bypassed their ears and spoke directly to something primitive in their brains. The incidents piled up on Joel's desk like autumn leaves. A solo hiker found wandering in circles, mumbling about the song of the earth. A family of 4 who abandoned their campsite, leaving behind everything but the clothes on their backs. A wildlife photographer whose cameras had captured nothing but static and strange shadows. Several returned shaken, their eyes holding that same vacant look, insisting the sound was alive, not just a noise, but something with intent, with hunger. Joel, skeptical by nature and trained to seek logical explanations, initially chalked it up to mass hysteria, the way fear could spread through a community like wildfire. The wilderness had a way of playing tricks on people, of amplifying their deepest fears until they saw monsters in every shadow. But as the incidents piled up, he couldn't ignore the patterns anymore. Then he could ignore the way the hum had begun to invade his dreams. One evening, as the late summer sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, he decided to investigate Pinecrest Trail again. The decision felt both inevitable and foolish, like walking willingly into the mouth of something ancient and hungry. He parked his truck at the trailhead, the cooling engine ticking like a countdown in the gathering dusk. The hum greeted him almost immediately, faint but unmistakable, like a distant choir singing in a language too old for human tongues. Joel paused, straining to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air had learned to sing. His boots crunched on the needle-strewn path, each step taking him deeper into the grove where the trees grew so thick they seemed to be watching, their bark-covered faces turned inward to track his progress. As he walked deeper into the grove, the sound grew louder, more defined. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It had texture, like overlapping tones harmonizing in a low hypnotic rhythm that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. The ground beneath his boots vibrated subtly, as though the forest itself were purring with dark satisfaction. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying the musty scent of decay and something else, something metallic and ancient. At the trail's end, Joel stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there, something that hadn't been visible on any of his previous patrols. A scattering of old mining equipment half buried in moss and memories. Rusted pickaxes lay like discarded bones, their handles rotted to nothing. A crumbling wheelbarrow listed to one side, its wheel frozen in an eternal turn. A collapsed wooden structure, the remnants of a camp long abandoned. jutted from the earth like the ribcage of some massive, decaying beast. The scene felt wrong, as if he'd walked into a photograph from another time that had somehow superimposed itself onto the present. He crouched, ignoring the way his skin crawled with unseen electricity, and brushed away decades of debris to reveal a broken lantern. The metal was corroded, but he could still make out words etched into its base. Ridgewater Mining Co. The discovery sat in his stomach like a stone, heavy with implications he wasn't ready to face. Joel frowned, his ranger's knowledge warring with this new evidence. He'd never heard of a mining operation in this area, and the park's records made no mention of it. As he stood, knees creaking in protest, the hum surged with sudden violence. The sound pressed against his skull like a physical force, carrying with it impressions of deep places and darker secrets, of men driven mad by what they found beneath the earth. "Time to go," he muttered, backing away from the site. His voice sounded thin and meaningless against the forest's ancient song. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching like grasping fingers, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw shapes moving in the deepening shadows, shapes that had nothing to do with wind or wildlife. Back at the ranger station, surrounded by the comforting normality of fluorescent lights and filing cabinets, Joel pored over old maps and records. Hours slipped by as he searched for any mention of Ridgewater Mining Co., his coffee growing cold beside him. The park's official documents offered nothing but silence, as if the company had been carefully excised from history. The absence of information felt deliberate, a blank space where truth should have been. Frustrated, he reached out to Sarah, hoping her decade-plus of experience might shed some light on the mystery. The phone rang 3 times before she answered, her voice thick with sleep despite the early hour. "Ever hear of a mining camp near Pinecrest?" he asked without preamble. She paused, and he could almost see her frown. "Can't say I have. Why?" "Found some old equipment out there," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Figured it might explain some of the weirdness. Maybe they hit a pocket of natural gas or something." The explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You think gas is making people hear things?" she asked, skepticism clear in her voice. "Making them all hear the same thing?" "Could be," Joel replied, though he didn't quite believe it himself. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. The hum persisted through the changing seasons, and so did the incidents. They took on a darker tone as autumn approached, like a predator growing bold with hunger. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the station roof like impatient fingers, Joel received a panicked call from a group of teenage campers. Their friend had wandered off after hearing what they described as singing from inside the mountain. The fear in their voices was raw, primal. Joel found the boy hours later, sitting cross-legged by the mining site, his face blank and his hands trembling like autumn leaves. The teenager's eyes were fixed on something Joel couldn't see, something that had stripped away all the protective layers of civilization and left behind something ancient and terrified. "I had to follow it," the boy mumbled, his voice distant and dreamy. "It was calling me, showing me things. Things under the ground, under the roots, old things, hungry things." His words sent a chill down Joel's spine that had nothing to do with the damp air. Joel escorted the boy back to his group, but his unease had deepened into something approaching certainty. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was something more, something that got into people's heads and rearranged the furniture of their minds, something that was getting stronger. Determined to get answers before winter sealed the wilderness under a blanket of snow and darkness, Joel reached out to a local historian, a retired professor named Dr. Marjorie Grant. They met at her small, cluttered home near the park's edge, where books climbed the walls like ivy, and the air smelled of old paper and wood smoke. She was a tiny woman with sharp eyes and hands that never stopped moving, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Marjorie listened intently as Joel described the hum and the mining site, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on her teacup. "Ridgewater mining," she said finally, tapping her chin. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. Not many left who remember it now." She rose and moved to an ancient filing cabinet, retrieving a yellowed folder. They operated in the 1930s, prospecting for gold. But there was something else, something they found in the deep places. The camp shut down suddenly, without explanation. But there were rumors. "What kind of rumors?" Joel leaned forward, drawn in despite himself. "They said the workers went mad," Marjorie continued, spreading old photographs across her desk. "Claimed the earth was singing to them, calling them. The deeper they dug, the louder it got. Some said they found something down there, something that should have stayed buried." "Singing?" Joel asked, his mouth dry. The photographs showed groups of men standing proud before mine entrances, their faces growing more haunted in each successive image. Marjorie nodded, her eyes distant. "It's just folklore, but they said the sound drove them insane. Some wandered into the forest and never came back, leaving behind half-eaten meals and letters home they never finished. Others turned violent, attacking their fellow workers with picks and shovels, screaming about the voices in the rock. The company buried the story to avoid scandal, sealed the mines, and erased their presence as best they could." Joel felt a chill that seemed to reach into his bones. "Did anyone figure out what caused it?" "No," Marjorie said, closing the folder with a finality that spoke of endings better left unexplored. "But some believe the land holds memories, traumas. The native peoples of this region had stories about places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where things could slip through from elsewhere. The hum might be the forest's way of speaking, or warning. Or perhaps," she added, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, "it's something else entirely. Something using the forest as a mouth to call to us." That night, Joel couldn't sleep. The hum was louder than ever, resonating through the walls of his cabin like the breathing of some vast, buried creature. It seemed to carry voices now, whispered fragments of sound that almost made sense, almost resolved into words he could understand. He lay in bed, watching shadows dance across his ceiling, until he couldn't stand it anymore. He stepped outside into the autumn night, flashlight in hand, drawn back to Pinecrest Trail like a moth to flame. The forest seemed different in darkness, more alive, more aware. The hum wove through the trees like a living thread, creating patterns of sound that his mind struggled to comprehend. His flashlight beam caught drops of dew on spider webs, making them shine like constellations of tiny watching eyes. At the mining site, Joel found something that hadn't been there before: a pit, freshly exposed as if the earth itself had opened up in hunger. The hum emanated from its depths, with physical force, a pulsating rhythm that made his teeth ache and his vision swim. The sound seemed almost solid now, a thing of texture and weight that pressed against him like invisible hands. He edged closer, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated jagged rocks slick with moisture, and something else, something glinting with a light that had nothing to do with his flashlight's reflection. A set of eyes stared back at him from the darkness, eyes that held the weight of eons in their ancient depths. They weren't animal eyes, weren't human eyes, weren't anything that should exist in a world of sunlight and solid ground. They were the eyes of something that had waited in the deep places since before humans learned to walk upright. Something that had been waiting for someone to dig deep enough, to listen long enough, to finally hear its song. Joel stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped thing trying to escape. The hum surged, drowning out his thoughts, filling his mind with images of vast underground spaces and things that moved in darkness. It pulled at him with invisible threads, trying to draw him closer to those ancient, hungry eyes. He turned to run but found himself frozen, his body refusing to obey as the song of something older than time itself filled his head with promises and secrets. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the hum stopped. The silence was like a physical blow, leaving Joel collapsed on his knees in the damp earth, gasping for air that tasted of decay and age-old stone. When he finally found the courage to look back at the pit, it was empty, the darkness impenetrable. But he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that something had seen him, marked him, added him to an ancient tally of those who had heard its song. Joel filed a report with the Park Service the next morning, his hands shaking as he typed. He recommended that Pinecrest Trail be closed indefinitely, citing dangerous ground conditions and structural instability from the old mining operations. He didn't mention the eyes or the pit. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him, wasn't sure he believed it himself in the harsh light of day. But as he signed off on the paperwork, listening to the faint hum that still lingered at the edges of his awareness, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with him. The hum still lingered in his mind, a haunting melody that refused to fade, a song that had become part of his internal rhythm. It wasn't just the land holding memories. It was something deeper, something alive, something that had been waiting since the first humans dared to dig into the earth's dark places. And whatever it was, Joel knew it would keep calling, drawing people into its grasp with its siren song of secrets and ancient knowledge, until someone found a way to silence it for good, or until it finally got what it wanted. He sat at his desk, listening to the hum that only he could hear, and wondered which would come first. Dennis Howard leaned against his rusted Ford F-150, sipping lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos as the sun set over the Wyoming wilderness. The ancient ridges that framed the national park were bathed in golden light, their jagged silhouettes stark against the fading sky, like the spine of some long-dead beast. Weathered pines dotted the slopes, their shadows stretching like grasping fingers across the rocky terrain. It was a view Dennis had grown used to after 15 years as a park ranger, but tonight something felt off. The air held an electric tension, like the moment before a lightning strike. The silence was what bothered him most. Wyoming's backcountry was never truly quiet. There should have been bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the pines. But tonight, the wilderness seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The rookie, Emma Grant, jogged up to him, her boots kicking up small clouds of ochre dust that hung suspended in the still air. Her regulation Forest Service uniform was still crisp and new, unlike Dennis's weathered gear that bore the marks of countless patrols. "Anything?" she asked, brushing her auburn hair out of her face, her cheeks flushed from the climb. Dennis shook his head, the movement slow and deliberate. "Not yet, but it's too damn quiet. Even the wind's holding its breath." He'd spent enough time in these mountains to know when something wasn't right. and every instinct honed by years in the wilderness was screaming at him now. Emma scanned the horizon, her gaze lingering on the ridgelines where deep shadows had begun to pool in the rocky crevices. The fading sunlight caught her face, highlighting the worry lines that hadn't been there when she'd started the job 3 months ago. "I've been meaning to ask," she said, her voice carrying an undercurrent of tension. "The hikers who disappeared last week, did anyone ever find out what happened?" Dennis's grip tightened on his thermos, the metal creaking under his fingers. The memory of that empty campsite was still fresh in his mind. The tent still standing, sleeping bags neatly laid out, a pot of coffee cooling on a dead fire. No signs of bears or mountain lions. No tracks leading away from the camp. Just nothing. Nope. Just an empty tent and their packs. No tracks. No signs of struggle. It's like they walked into thin air. Emma nodded, though the unease in her eyes was clear as mountain water. She'd heard the rumors. Everyone in the Park Service had by now. Stories of shadowy figures on the ridges, strange symbols carved into ancient pines, and an old legend about the Watchers, guardians of sacred land who didn't take kindly to trespassers. The kind of tales you'd dismiss as campfire stories, if not for the growing number of unexplained incidents. Dennis hadn't believed the stories, not at first. He was a practical man, more concerned with managing wildlife populations and maintaining trails than chasing folklore. But the last few months had changed his mind, forced him to question everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The first sighting had been at dusk, 3 weeks before Emma arrived. Dennis had been patrolling the eastern ridge, checking for illegal campsites after reports of fire rings too close to the tree line. The September air had been crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. When he saw them, tall, dark figures standing motionless on the horizon, their forms impossibly elongated against the darkening sky. At first he thought they were trees or rocks, catching the fading light. The mind had a way of finding patterns in shadow. But when one shifted, its elongated form moving against the wind with a fluid grace that defied natural movement, he felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. By the time he'd reached the ridge, hiking at a pace that left him winded, the figures were gone, leaving only silence in their wake and an inexplicable sense of being watched. Then the disappearances began. Hikers, campers, even a wildlife photographer who'd spent 20 years documenting the park's elk populations, all vanished without a trace. Each case followed the same pattern. Abandoned equipment, no signs of animal attack, no tracks leading away. The Park Service had chalked it up to accidents or animal attacks, filing reports full of reasonable explanations that explained nothing. But Dennis wasn't so sure. The wilderness was vast, but it didn't just swallow people whole. Not like this. "Ridge Patrol," Dennis said now, tossing his thermos into the truck bed with a hollow clang. The sound echoed unnaturally in the still air. "We'll head out together. Keep your eyes on the ridgelines." He checked his radio, flashlight, and the sidearm he carried, more for comfort than protection. Something told him bullets wouldn't make a difference against what waited in the gathering dark. Emma followed without hesitation, her own gear checked and double-checked with rookie thoroughness. The trail was steep and rugged, winding through dense stands of lodgepole pine and over rocky outcrops worn smooth by centuries of wind. As they climbed, the air grew colder and the shadows deeper, pooling in hollows and between rocks like black water. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their boots on gravel and their increasingly labored breathing. "You believe the stories?" Emma asked, her voice low, as if afraid to disturb the unnatural quiet. "About the Watchers?" Dennis hesitated, choosing his words carefully. 15 years ago, he would have dismissed such talk without a second thought. Now, I don't know what to believe anymore. But I know this. People don't just vanish. Something out here doesn't want us around. The words felt heavy in the still air, like admitting a truth he'd been trying to deny. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with deep purples and blues that bled into absolute darkness. Dennis scanned the landscape, his hand resting on the flashlight clipped to his belt. The ridgeline stretched out before them like the teeth of some ancient beast, stark and empty against the darkening sky. The valley below was lost in shadow, and the distant peaks seemed to float on a sea of darkness. "See anything?" Emma asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. Dennis shook his head. Not yet. But even as he spoke, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Years in the wilderness had taught him to trust his instincts, and every one of them was screaming danger. Then, as they turned to head back, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He stopped, squinting against the twilight that seemed to shift and flow like water. There, on the opposite ridge, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, impossibly so, its outline sharp against the darkening sky like a tear in reality itself. The proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, torso too narrow, head too still. "Emma," he said quietly, motioning for her to look. His mouth had gone dry, and his heart hammered against his ribs. "Over there." She followed his gaze, her breath hitching audibly. "What the hell is that?" The fear in her voice was raw, primal, the kind of fear that reached back to when humans first huddled around fires in the dark. Before Dennis could answer, the figure moved. It didn't walk or run, but seemed to glide, its motion unnaturally smooth, like oil flowing over water. It disappeared behind the ridge with a grace that defied physics, leaving only a heavy silence and the certainty that they were being watched. "Let's go," Dennis said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Now." The walk back to the truck was tense, every shadow seeming to hide watching eyes. Emma stayed close, her flashlight beam darting nervously through the trees that suddenly seemed more like bars of a cage than living things. The sound of their boots on gravel was too loud, too obvious. By the time they reached the trailhead, the tension was palpable, a physical presence pressing against their skin. "What did we just see?" Emma asked, her voice trembling as she leaned against the truck, her face pale in the beam of the parking lot's single security light. Dennis didn't answer immediately. He stared at the ridgelines, now shrouded in darkness that seemed deeper than natural night. "Something that shouldn't be here," he finally said, the words feeling inadequate against the weight of what they'd witnessed. The following morning, after a sleepless night filled with shadows and half-glimpsed movements at the edge of vision, Dennis decided to dig deeper. He drove into town, the early morning sun doing little to dispel the chill that had settled in his bones. The local library was housed in an old sandstone building that had served as a courthouse during Wyoming's territorial days. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and wood polish, and the silence was broken only by the soft whir of ancient heating vents. Dennis spent hours combing through old records and maps, most yellowed with age and crumbling at the edges. Most of the documents were mundane: logging routes, land surveys, wildlife reports that tracked the ebb and flow of elk and wolf populations. But tucked away in a dusty binder, its cover faded and spine cracked, he found something curious: an old ledger from the 1800s detailing a dispute between settlers and the local indigenous tribe. The pages were brittle with age, the handwriting spidery and faded, but the story they told made Dennis's blood run cold. According to the ledger, the settlers had attempted to claim the ridgelines for farming, planning to clear the timber and terrace the slopes. But the tribe had fiercely opposed them, with a vehemence that went beyond the usual territorial disputes of the era. They believed the land was sacred, protected by beings they called Watchers, ancient guardians who would curse anyone who dared to trespass on their domain. The settlers had dismissed these warnings as superstition, but the ledger told a different story. Men began to disappear. Others reported seeing tall figures watching from the ridges at dusk. The conflict ended in bloodshed, and the settlers eventually abandoned the area, leaving the ridgelines untouched. Dennis closed the binder with trembling hands, his jaw tight. The parallels were too strong to ignore. What they'd seen on the ridge wasn't new. It had been there all along, watching, waiting. That evening, he and Emma returned to the ridge, armed with stronger flashlights and a sense of foreboding that sat like lead in their stomachs. Dennis hadn't told her about the ledger. Not yet. He wanted to see if the Watchers would show themselves again. Needed to confirm that what they'd seen wasn't just shadows and imagination playing tricks in the twilight. They didn't have to wait long. As the last light faded from the sky, painting the clouds in shades of blood and bruise, the figures appeared. 3 this time, standing in a row along the ridge like dark sentinels. Their forms were sharper now, more defined in the failing light, their elongated limbs almost insect-like in their impossible angles. They seemed to absorb the light around them, creating pools of deeper darkness in the gathering night. "Stay close," Dennis whispered, his hand on his flashlight. The metal was slick with sweat despite the cold air. The figures didn't move, standing silent and still, watching with an intensity that could be felt like a physical pressure. Then, as if on some unseen signal, one stepped forward. Its movement was fluid, almost serpentine, as it descended the ridge toward them with a grace that denied the steep, rocky terrain. "Dennis," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper, thick with terror. "What do we do?" He didn't answer. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee back to the safety of artificial lights and human habitation. But his legs felt rooted to the spot, his body refusing to obey as the figure drew closer. Its outline became more distinct with each impossible step, and Dennis caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was only a smooth, featureless void, a darkness deeper than the night around them. The sight broke whatever spell had held him in place. "Run," he said, grabbing Emma's arm with fingers that had gone numb with cold and fear. "Now." They sprinted down the trail, the sound of their ragged breaths and pounding footsteps unnaturally loud in the still air. Behind them, a soft hum of movement grew louder, as if the Watcher was gliding just out of sight, toying with them. Branches seemed to reach for them in the darkness. Rocks shifted unexpectedly under their feet. When they finally reached the truck, Dennis fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them. Emma turned, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness like a blade. "It's gone," she said, though her voice was uncertain, higher than normal, with barely controlled panic. Dennis didn't wait to find out if she was right. He started the engine and sped down the dirt road, the ridges disappearing into the rearview mirror like a receding nightmare. But the weight of unseen eyes followed them all the way back to the station. Back at the ranger station, under the harsh fluorescent lights that suddenly seemed feeble against the darkness outside the windows, Dennis finally told Emma about the ledger. She listened in silence, her face growing paler with each detail. her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "So, what?" she said when he finished, her voice hollow. "The Watchers are protecting the ridges? From us?" "Maybe," Dennis said, staring at the darkness beyond the window. "Or maybe they're protecting something else. Something we're not supposed to know about." He thought about the smooth, featureless face, the impossible movements, the way the very air seemed to bend around the figures. "Either way, we're not welcome here." Emma leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant, seeing something beyond the station's walls. "What do we do?" Dennis didn't have an easy answer. The Park Service wouldn't shut down the ridgelines over folklore and unexplained sightings, and he doubted anyone would believe their story. The modern world had no place for ancient guardians and sacred ground. But as he stared at the map on the wall, the ridgelines marked in bold topographic lines, his resolve hardened. "We warn people," he said, his voice firm, "as best we can, and we stay away from the ridges." It wasn't a solution, not really, but it was all they could do against something so far beyond their understanding. Over the following weeks, Dennis made good on his promise. He posted warning signs about unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife. He closed trails for maintenance and environmental assessment. He kept a wary eye on the ridgelines, especially at dusk, when the shadows began to move in ways shadows shouldn't. The figures still appeared, always at dusk, always watching with their featureless faces. But Dennis no longer tried to approach them or understand their purpose. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, some boundaries not meant to be crossed. Whatever the Watchers were, ancient guardians, interdimensional beings, or something else entirely, they weren't meant to be understood by human minds. The wilderness held its secrets, and some were better left alone. But on quiet nights, when the wind died and the shadows grew long, Dennis could feel them watching from the ridges. And he wondered how long they'd been there, standing sentinel over their ancient domain, and how long they'd continue to watch as humanity pressed ever closer to boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. The modern world might have forgotten the old ways, the old warnings, but the Watchers hadn't forgotten their purpose, and in the gathering dark, they waited, patient and eternal, for those who would stray too close to their sacred ground. The ranger station was quiet that morning, the radio's static a low hum in the background as Leah Nguyen prepared for her patrol. Outside, fog clung to the ground like ghostly fingers, unusual for this time of year. A stack of incident reports sat on her desk, their manila folders worn at the edges from handling, most of them routine matters that came with managing a wilderness area. Lost hikers wandering off marked trails, fallen trees blocking access roads, wildlife sightings that turned out to be shadows and branches in the twilight. But one report stood out, its crisp edges suggesting recent filing. A family of 4 had gone missing near Crescent Lake, a remote and rarely visited part of the park that didn't appear on any tourist maps. Why were they even out there? Leah muttered to herself as she scanned the report for the 3rd time, her coffee growing cold beside her. The words seemed to blur together, but certain phrases jumped out. No disturbance at campsite. All belongings present. No signs of wildlife involvement. Crescent Lake wasn't on any official trail maps, and for good reason. The locals avoided it like a wound in the landscape, their voices dropping to whispers when they spoke of it at all. They called it cursed, though each telling of why varied with the teller. Some spoke of strange reflections that didn't quite match reality. Others of an unsettling feeling that crept into your bones if you ventured too close, like being watched by something ancient and hungry. Leah wasn't one to believe in curses. 10 years as a park ranger had taught her that most supernatural occurrences had perfectly natural explanations. Odd lights were usually headlamps reflected off fog. Mysterious sounds could be traced to wind, through rock formations or animals in the underbrush, and strange shadows were typically nothing more than branches moving in the twilight. But something about this family's disappearance gnawed at her like a splinter in her mind. Their tent and belongings had been found intact, arranged as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. No tracks led away from the campsite. No notes explained their absence. No signs of struggle suggested foul play. Just nothing, as if they'd been erased from existence. By midday, she'd made up her mind. The rational part of her brain said to wait for backup, to follow standard search and rescue protocols. But time was critical in missing persons cases, and something in her gut told her this couldn't wait. Grabbing her pack, double-checking her first aid kit, extra batteries, emergency flares, Leah radioed her route to dispatch, heading to Crescent Lake to check the area, back by sundown. She hesitated, then added her GPS coordinates, though something told her they wouldn't help if things went wrong. "Copy that," came the crackling reply, distorted by static that seemed thicker than usual. "Stay safe out there." The warning felt heavier than normal routine radio sign-offs. The trail to Crescent Lake was overgrown, decades of neglect evident in the thick undergrowth that choked the narrow path. Leah's boots crunched against dead leaves and broken branches as she moved steadily uphill, each step taking her deeper into territory that seemed to resist human presence. Old-growth pines towered overhead, their branches weaving together so tightly that sunlight barely pierced the canopy, creating a perpetual twilight that made her flashlight necessary, even at midday. The air grew cooler the closer she got to her destination, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made her wrinkle her nose, like old pennies or blood. Her radio crackled occasionally, but the messages were unintelligible, lost in waves of static that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. The forest around her grew quieter with each step, the normal sounds of wilderness, birdsong, rustling leaves, scurrying animals, fading until only the sound of her own breathing remained. The silence felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time she reached the lake, the sun was high overhead, though its light seemed somehow diminished, casting long beams across the water's surface that behaved strangely, bending in ways that light shouldn't. Crescent Lake lived up to its name, its curved shoreline embracing the surrounding forest like a lover's arms. The water was still, unnaturally so, its surface smooth as polished obsidian. Not a single ripple disturbed its perfect reflection of the sky above. Leah stepped to the edge, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. Her reflection stared back at her with unnerving clarity, every detail perfect, too perfect. She crouched, drawn by some inexplicable compulsion to touch the water. It was colder than she expected, sending a shiver up her arm that seemed to reach directly into her bones. The ripples from her touch spread outward, but something about their movement was wrong, as if they were traveling through a medium thicker than water. Something about the reflection caught her eye, a detail that her mind initially refused to process. Frowning, she leaned closer, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. Her reflection wasn't moving with her. When she tilted her head, the mirrored Leah stayed perfectly still, its gaze locked on hers with an intensity that felt predatory. The reflected eyes were darker than they should be, holding shadows that shouldn't exist in the midday light. Leah stumbled back, her pulse thundering in her ears. She shook her head violently, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a product of stress and solitude. But when she looked again, forcing herself to confront what she'd seen, The reflection was gone entirely, though the sky and trees remained perfectly mirrored on the lake's surface. The campsite was less than 50 feet from the lake's edge, positioned in a small clearing that offered a clear view of the water. The family's tent stood undisturbed, its blue fabric bright against the muted forest colors. Their gear was neatly arranged inside, sleeping bags laid out in careful rows, backpacks propped against the far wall. A deck of playing cards scattered across a ground sheet as if abandoned mid-game. Leah's unease deepened as she examined the scene. There was no sign of panic, no evidence they'd left in a hurry. Even their shoes were lined up outside the tent entrance, waiting for owners who had vanished into thin air. A digital camera sat on a nearby log, its lens cap missing. She picked it up with trembling fingers, the plastic warm despite the cool air, as if it had been recently handled. The power button responded to her touch, the screen flickering to life with an artificial cheerfulness that seemed obscene in the oppressive atmosphere. The photos stored in its memory told a story that made her blood run cold. They started normally enough, smiling faces captured in the golden light of sunset, forested trails winding into green shadows, shots of the lake reflecting a sky that looked somehow different from the one currently above her. Then the images changed, becoming increasingly disturbing. The last few were blurry, taken in quick succession, as if the photographer's hands had been shaking. One showed ripples spreading across the lake's surface, though there was no wind to cause them. Another captured what looked like a shadow stretching out from the water, long and spindly like reaching fingers. The final image was completely black, as if the camera had been submerged, or as if something dark and absolute had filled the frame entirely. Leah's stomach churned as she lowered the camera, her mouth dry with fear. She scanned the campsite again, looking for anything she might have missed. A journal lay open on one of the sleeping bags, its pages blank except for a single line written in shaky handwriting. "It shows us things in the water." "Where did you go?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the unnatural silence. As the afternoon wore on, Leah circled the lake methodically, her eyes scanning the shoreline for any clues that might explain the family's disappearance. The air felt heavier with each step, pressing against her skin like a physical weight. The silence had become absolute, a vacuum that seemed to pull at her ears. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through leaves. Just the faint sound of her own breathing and the thundering of her heart. Halfway around the lake, she found something that made her stop short. Footprints, leading from the water to the forest. But they weren't right. The impressions were shallow, as if whoever had made them was unnaturally light, barely touching the earth. And they stopped abruptly at the tree line, vanishing into the underbrush as if their owner had simply ceased to exist. "This doesn't make sense," Leah muttered, crouching to run her fingers over the damp soil. The tracks were fresh, the edges still sharp, but the pattern was wrong. Too long between steps, the gait inhuman. The water behind her rippled, a soft splash breaking the stillness. Leah froze, her muscles locking with primal fear. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run, she turned. The lake was empty, its surface undisturbed as glass, but the reflection was wrong again, horrifyingly wrong. The sky above was clear, a perfect late afternoon blue, but in the lake's mirror surface, dark clouds churned like living things, streaked with flashes of lightning that cast no light on the real world above. A chill ran down her spine, raising goosebumps along her arms. Leah backed away, her instincts screaming at her to flee. But something kept her rooted in place, a strange pull she couldn't explain, as if the lake itself was calling to her. whispering promises just below the threshold of hearing. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest that seemed to reach for her with grasping fingers. Leah set up a makeshift camp a safe distance from the lake, though safe felt like a meaningless concept in this place, where reality seemed to bend and warp. She'd tried to radio her findings to dispatch multiple times, but received only static in response. Static that sometimes seemed to form words just beyond comprehension. As night fell, the lake began to glow faintly, its surface reflecting moonlight with an unnatural intensity that didn't match the cloud-covered sky above. Leah sat by her fire, but the warmth did nothing to chase away the bone-deep cold that had settled into her body. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their source, twisting into shapes that her mind refused to process. The forest around her was still, the silence broken only by the crackle of her fire and the pounding of blood in her ears. Then, faintly at first but growing stronger, she heard it. A voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, carried on a breeze that didn't stir the trees. Leah. Her blood ran cold, heart stuttering in her chest. She stood, shining her flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trunks and branches that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The voice came again, closer this time, intimate as a lover's whisper. Leah, come here. She turned toward the lake, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The water rippled gently, though there was no wind to disturb its surface. In its depths, she saw herself again, standing motionless. But this reflection was wrong, all wrong. Its edges were too sharp, its movements too fluid when it moved. It raised a hand, beckoning with fingers that were slightly too long, joints bending in impossible ways. No, Leah whispered, shaking her head. She stepped back, clutching the flashlight like a talisman against the darkness. The beam flickered, weakening as if something was drawing the power from it. The reflection's mouth twisted into a smile that was too wide, filled with too many teeth. Its eyes had gone completely black, like holes punched in reality. Leah didn't sleep. She couldn't, not with the lake watching her with eyes that weren't eyes, not with the voice that kept calling her name in tones that grew increasingly less human. She sat by the fire, feeding it constantly, her eyes fixed on the water that seemed to have developed its own gravity, pulling at her attention, her thoughts, her very being. The stories she'd dismissed as folklore now felt all too real, too inadequate to describe the horror that lived in Crescent Lake. It wasn't cursed. It was something worse. It wasn't just a place. It was alive, watching, waiting. And it was hungry. By dawn, which came too slowly and brought too little light, the decision was clear. She had to leave before she joined the family and who knew how many others in whatever fate the lake had in store for them. She packed her gear quickly, her movements frantic, dropping things and fumbling with buckles as if her fingers had forgotten how to work. As she turned to go, the voice came again, louder now, insistent. But it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, overlapping in a cacophony that made her head spin. Don't go. Leah froze, her body refusing to move as the reflection, her reflection, but not her reflection, stood at the water's edge, mirroring her perfectly. But it wasn't her. Its eyes were darker than the deepest parts of the lake, its smile wider than any human mouth could stretch, its movements slightly off, like a video played at the wrong speed. Stay, it said, stepping forward. The water rippled around its feet, but the ripples moved wrong, spreading inward instead of out. Stay with me. The voice was hers, but layered with others, men, women, children, all speaking in unison with a hunger that was ancient and absolute. Leah backed away, her breath coming in short gasps that frosted an air that had suddenly grown arctic cold. The reflection's form began to change, elongating, its limbs stretching unnaturally like softened wax. Shadows pooled around it, spreading across the ground like spilled ink, reaching for her with tendrils that moved with terrible purpose. She turned and ran, the forest blurring around her as she crashed through underbrush and leaped fallen logs. The voice followed, growing louder, multiplying into a chorus of whispers that filled her mind like static. Stay, stay, stay. Branches whipped at her face, roots seemed to reach up to trip her, and the very air felt thick, as if the lake's influence was trying to pull her back. But she ran, driven by a terror that overrode exhaustion and pain, until the whispers finally faded and normal forest sounds returned. By the time Leah reached the ranger station, she was trembling uncontrollably, her clothes damp with sweat and morning dew. She burst through the door, startling Sarah, who sat at the radio desk updating the morning logs. "Leah, what happened?" Sarah asked, rising to her feet, alarm clear on her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Leah struggled to find words that could encompass the horror she'd witnessed, the wrongness that lived in Crescent Lake. "The lake. It's not right. It's..." Sarah guided her to a chair, her expression worried as she pressed a cup of coffee into Leah's shaking hands. "Slow down. What happened out there?" Leah took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts into something that wouldn't sound completely insane. "The lake. It's like it's alive. It's pulling people in, replacing them. They're reflections. They're not them. They're something else. Something that wears their faces like masks." Sarah stared at her, the color draining from her face. "You're serious?" Leah nodded, the movement jerky and uncontrolled. "We have to close it off. No one can go there. Ever. It's hungry, and it's getting stronger." Over the following weeks, Crescent Lake was officially marked as off-limits. Signs were posted warning of hazardous conditions. Trails were blocked with fallen trees and rock slides carefully arranged to look natural. And Leah wrote a detailed report for the Park Service that carefully omitted the more inexplicable aspects of her experience. But the lake stayed with her, its whispers haunting her dreams, its dark promises echoing in the quiet hours of night. One evening, as she sat in her cabin writing up the day's reports, she caught her reflection in the window. For a moment, just a moment, it didn't move with her. It simply stared, its smile just a little too wide, its eyes a little too dark. And behind it, in the glass's double reflection, she thought she saw the surface of a lake, perfectly still, waiting. Leah turned away, her pulse racing. She didn't look at reflective surfaces anymore if she could help it. Some things, once seen, couldn't be unseen. And sometimes, when the night was very still, she could hear it calling, promising to show her what lived beneath its surface, in the place where the sky drowned and shadows wore familiar faces. The lake was patient. It could wait. After all, everyone had to look at their reflection eventually.